Chosen chapters from the Velvet Paw of Asquith novels, also known as the Duvin books, by Thomas Caulfield. Read by the author. Chapter 6 from The Alchemist of Ra, Chapter 11, in which Oscar endures the sort of ego so voluminous that it requires flags to warn low-flying aircraft. Oscar sat on a chair in the Dodderset's hotel room, with a posture suggesting boredom with everything the cat said. His efforts, however, had been undermined by Varsivy, who'd insisted that Oscar be present during the interview because he was an intern, which also undermined his prior heckling. The Dodderset delighted in Oscar's discomfort and boasted about his own brilliance to emphasise their disparity. Having admired the carpet, wallpaper and window frame to the point of redundancy, Oscar yawned to suggest the cat's spiel was little more than lullaby. Although he was pleased that Varsivy's demeanour had improved, he hoped it wasn't a result of the Dodderset's abominable flattery. "It is of course quite true," the cat was saying, looking at the ceiling while tapping claws together. "I am brilliant, but I'm not the first to say it. My personality is brilliant, my paws are brilliant, and my mental ability is beyond that of others. In fact, it's sheer brilliance that permits not only my triumph over danger, but to compose the sort of verse that leaves audiences weeping." Oscar humphed, certain their tears were entirely because of it. Varsivy nodded and scribbled in a notebook, scribing him word for word, despite her question having been about his favourite type of collar. Oscar burped, and they looked at him. "What?" The Dodderset leant toward him as a professor might encourage a student. "You have something to say, perhaps?" Being on Curiosa, Oscar refrained from telling him. "Good," the Dodderset said, with a wink at Varsivy. "I was worried you might, which means we'd have to wade through more of the rubbish you spewed at my recital." "I spoke earlier when I could be bothered," Oscar said, "when I thought you had credibility. Now that I realise you're a complete git, I can't be bothered." The Dodderset smiled at Varsivy, but spoke to him. "A coward's retreat indeed." Oscar refused to rise. Varsivy asked, "The Dodderset, is it true that you have been to every corner of the world?" "Miss Varsivy," he stopped and asked, "do you mind if I call you Miss Varsivy?" She smiled that she did not. "Miss Varsivy," he said, looking at the ceiling again, "I have been asked that question many times, and were the world a cube, I would answer yes. But as we all know," he jabbed a paw at Oscar, "except perhaps him, the world is a sphere and has no corners. It does, however, have an infinite number of points, some of which I have indeed passed wind." They looked at Oscar, who said what again? Varsivy returned to her notes. "You describe yourself as a bard," she said. "Why so, rather than a poet?" "Because it's easier to spell," suggested Oscar. "I am both traveller and poet," he said, flashing a glare at him. "I explore the world and become inspired by it. I'm also kind and brilliant. So I share my experiences with those who have no opportunity to do the same. I am, if you like, a traveller who forges bravery with art, and I deserve a title worthy. Therefore I am greater than any lowly poet." He gazed upon Varsivy as though his splendidness might have her weep. "I give because I can, Miss Varsivy. I share because I must. Indeed, my selflessness borders on sacrifice." He raised his whiskers lest she wished to lunge and embrace him. "I cannot help such wonderfulness," he said. "It's simply who I am, don't you know?" Oscar readied to burp again, but stopped when Lumps suggested he shouldn't. "I must say," said Varsivy, "you certainly have a great deal of self-confidence." "I have a great deal of many things, Miss Varsivy." "Including fleas, apparently," said Oscar, pretending to pick one off the chair. "I think you'll find they're yours," the Dodderset said, still smiling at Varsivy. "I don't think so," said Oscar, peering at it. "This one has a perm." He flicked it away and asked, with about as much tact as playing chess with a hammer, "So where do you get all your money?" Varsivy gasped, and the Dododocet turned to stare. "What an unusual question," he said. "I'm an unusual cat," said Oscar. "Yes, you must be, especially if you work for Collars Monthly with particular emphasis on collars, yet look like that. Appearances can be deceiving, except, it appears, in your case." "I ask the difficult questions," said Oscar. "It's what I'm paid for." "Difficult questions or stupid ones?" Oscar leant forward. "Difficult, clearly, considering your inability to answer." The Dododocet laughed. "Oh, I can answer it, Cat. I just don't know whether you'd understand it." "I understand more than you might imagine. Not when it comes to me." "And why is that?" The Dododocet leant forward also. "Because you and I are at opposite ends of the evolutionary scale." Oscar smiled. "Well, perhaps if you work hard enough, you might catch up." With a sigh, Varsivy stepped in. "Perhaps we can talk about your history of collars." "No, Miss Varsivy," the Dododocet said, still glaring at Oscar. "It's fine, really. If this cat wants to know, then I'll gladly tell, but I fear the answer will only fuel his envy, don't you know?" Oscar was about to scoff when the cat held up a paw. "My charisma has rendered a great many donations to be hurled my way," he said. "The rulers of the lands I visit insist on lavishing me with gifts to the point of discomfort. Indeed, some have even offered to abdicate because they know I'll do a better job. As a consequence, I have accumulated a considerable fortune." He sat back, his whiskers raised. "Sometimes having looks, charisma and brilliance makes for rather easy living, don't you know? Or in your case, no you don't." He turned back to Varsivy. "Having ears helps enormously also." Gritting his teeth, Oscar said, "Yet you pay no taxes." Another laugh, and the cat turned again with eyes narrowed. "My travelling has me without abode," he said. "I roam, you see. I am a citizen of the world, rather than one particular country in it." "Yet you have mansions in several." "Oh, yes, indeed. And boats and cars and aeroplanes. I have a great many things that an animal like you could only hope for. Treasures, in fact. Secrets, don't you know?" Oscar raised his whiskers skeptically. "But despite my plethora of mansions," he continued, "you'll find that I linger in none of them, for I travel the world and spread myself liberally. By having no fixed abode, I am exempt from such trivialities as taxation." Oscar glowered. Although the explanation might satisfy the catacombs, why the cat would return such generosity with disrespectful poetry was beyond him. "Why do you find a need to insult the lands that shower you in gifts, then?" "We discussed this when you were shouting from a chair. Don't you remember?" "Remind me, for Varsivy's sake." The Dododocet looked at her. She smiled, her pen poised above notebook. "It is poetic license," he said. "That's sophistry," scoffed Oscar. The Dododocet shrugged. "Call it what you will. It makes no difference. The fact is that my brilliance and charisma render me very well kept, don't you know?" "No, I don't know," Oscar said, annoyed at the cat's habit of finishing every second sentence with the words. The Dododocet chuckled. "No, you wouldn't. And it's unfair of me to expect you to." "Well, regardless, the amount of stuff you have is ridiculous. You could do a lot of good in this world with that sort of wealth." "Oh, come now. Are you suggesting I surrender such things? Imagine the insult to those who gave them. Really, your sense of diplomacy is absent more than other parts of you." Oscar's glower faltered, and he looked away. "It is unfortunate that you have no ears," the Dododocet continued, "because you clearly haven't listened to a word I've said. I give all the time. I share with others things they could never experience themselves. Frankly, I open a window in their world and let the breeze in. I charge nothing for my recitals, and yet give everything." He glanced at Varsivy. "As I've said, I share because I must. Therefore, my selflessness borders on sacrifice. I think I've said that already. You should write that down. It's a good line. We both know your performances have got nothing to do with generosity, said Oscar, and everything to do with bolstering your ego. The Dodocet laughed. Oh, believe me, Cat, my ego needs no such strengthening. His eyes narrowed in consideration. Tell me, I recall you yelling something about having travelled. Where to, pray? Surprised he steered the conversation elsewhere, Oscar said, I'd rather continue talking about you, if you don't mind, and I'm certain you would too. Perhaps, said the Dodocet, with an award-winning smile. But you see, I'm intrigued to know how an animal of your stunted disposition might manage to catch a bus successfully, let alone travel anywhere in one, so perhaps you might enlighten me as to where you've been. No, said Oscar. I insist on talking about you. The Dodocet looked at Vasivi and said, Then I'm afraid that this interview is over. She raised a paw in the hope it wasn't. Well, I must say, said Oscar, I find it odd that you're suddenly uncomfortable talking about yourself, considering your recitals have you doing so for hours on end, regardless of the detriment to others. The Dodocet glared. It depends on what aspect of me I'm talking about. I see. So your wealth leaves you uncomfortable, does it? My ample fortune has got nothing to do with my poetry. Yes, that much I can certainly understand. After all, it's ridiculous that you might repay such generosity with insulting limerick. My work is not limerick. Of course, my mistake. Limericks generally scan. The Dodocet leapt from his chair and Oscar raised his whiskers. Before anything could escalate, Vasivi again intervened. Please, she said, there's no need for this. The Dodocet, I'm sorry, my colleague's so offensive. It's not his fault. He's in training. Training? For what? Massively reducing your readership? No, catering, actually. Both Oscar and the Dodocet stared at her. Catering? Said the cat. She nodded. Yes, he's here in case I get hungry. Still they stared. And then he gets me some food. Are you serious? He stared at Oscar. You're in catering? Oscar wasn't certain. Although he'd brought her a plate of crispy scales, it wasn't in any official capacity. Well, said the Dodocet, sitting again, that explains a lot. He's obviously been nowhere other than a kitchen. Certainly he couldn't catch a bus. Not only can I catch a bus, said Oscar, but I can spell it too, which is more than you'd manage. Oh, really? And where have you caught a bus to, Cat? Oscar fumed. He was a velvet paw of Asquith, not a caterer. Moreover, he'd already saved the world twice, and it was about time they knew as much. Vra, actually, he growled. The great grasslands of... The Dodocet stared as though electrically powered, but suddenly unplugged. He burst into laughter. Vra! He cried, struggling for breath. You've been to Vra! Oscar's look was rather less moved. Yes. The cat's mirth became veritable fits of hysteria, and he rolled in his chair until bordering on convulsion. Vasivi stared at him, uncertain whether she should be taking notes or sending for a doctor. When she glanced at Oscar, he shrugged. Vra! The cat cried. Oh, have mercy! Vra of all places! Yes, said Oscar indignantly. Vra. Have you heard of it, perhaps? More hysteria and tears. Have I heard of it? Have I indeed? I don't see what's so funny. And tell me, the Dodocet tried through strangled breaths, were you visiting for a holiday, perhaps? No, it was in a professional capacity. There was a spray of laughter so violent that a sponge was required. Business, indeed! And you got there, did you? You made it all the way to Vra? Well, nearly. Beside himself, the Dodocet doubled over in an attempt at staunching hilarity. Had room service arrived, they'd have had difficulty determining whether it was laughter or despair. Nearly! The animal cried, tears streaking his fur and making it glisten like cast gold. Oh, please, please no more! Yes, nearly, said Oscar. I don't see what's so funny. He looked at Vasi V, who had no idea either. Why is that so amusing? She asked. The animal's hysteria evaporated. While wiping his eyes, he clambered up from the floor. He sat and waited until breath returned. Because, Miss Vasi V, he said, no animal has ever been to the great grasslands of Vra. What? Never? Never. Oscar scoffed. No animal has ever been to Vra. No animal. I find that very hard to believe. But surely that can't be right, said Vasi V. There are aeroplanes and trains and boats and all sorts of things that would allow it, let alone sleeping bags. Ample means of doing so. Nevertheless, no animal has. I'm sorry, said Oscar, but I was specifically assigned there in the previous book. You can't tell me that no animal's been there if I was specifically asked to go there. But you didn't. Well, no, not exactly. I got distracted. But I intended to, which means something. It means nothing. They stared at him. I am the only animal to have made it to that land. Oscar frowned. I find that even harder to believe. Then tell me, how did you intend to get to the great grasslands of Vra? Oscar glanced at Vasi V, but she had little more to offer. He swallowed and said, Well, I flew down to Parbeguen for a start. And then I got distracted. But if you hadn't? I intended to catch a train south to Talsik Kur. He expected ridicule, but there was none. Only further thoughtful stares. Do you know anything of Talsik Kur? The Dododocet asked. Not particularly. I thought I'd wait until I got there. Well, let me tell you that there are no trains south from Parbeguen. Moreover, had you reached the city, you would have lasted no more than a minute in it. Why? Is it quite hot? No. It's because you would have been killed. There was a shocked silence, followed by a swallow from Oscar, who looked at Vasi V for clarity. Talsik Kur is one of the most dangerous ports in the world, the Dododocet said. It is a haven for smugglers and thugs, villains and rogues. Even if you were to find your way there and not get shoved on the end of a long pole to dust for cobwebs, then the great grasslands of Vra are an impossible journey further from such a place. And yet you've managed, Vasi V asked, amazed. With a sigh, he looked at his paws. Yes, I have indeed been to Vra once, but only my brilliance and bravery kept me alive. I have never returned, however, and I do not intend to. Despite the dangers in getting there, Vra is without question the most barren, dull, and pointless land in the world. He glared at them in turn, adding, The great grasslands of Vra are nothing more than that. Great grasslands. Although even the word great is a misnomer, for they hold nothing of interest for any creature. Of that, I can assure you. Unless one is particularly fond of grass, Oscar said. The Dodocet's glare darkened. They hold nothing of interest for any creature, he said. Of that, I can assure you. Oscar swallowed and wanted to mention grass again. From hilarity to despondence, the three animals fell silent. It was the Dododocet who broke their lassitude. I am hungry, he said, before looking at Oscar. Ring down to the kitchen, cat, and order some meals of food. You order some meals of food. No, you're the one in catering. Oscar was about to say something when Vasi V's look begged that he refrain. Unimpressed at any of this, he stood to do so. The thought of room service improved their demeanours, and while he rang reception, Vasi V asked where the Dododocet intended to explore next. The cat readily returned to smugness. My dear Miss Vasi V, he said, I intend to do little for some time other than remain in Plempt and ski its slopes. I'm a brilliant skier, don't you know? I can imagine. I live very well off the luxuries that fame and fortune have afforded me. Kitchen, Oscar grumbled into the telephone when an animal answered. He was put through and asked again what he wanted. Some meals of food, he said. He didn't elaborate, however, because on the other end of the line, screams arose. which wasn't expected from the kitchens of Hotel de Plempt unless specifically ordered. He moved the receiver to his other absent ear to hear plates smash, more screams, some arguing, followed by things breaking. Dropping the receiver, he hurried to the door. "What's the matter?" asked Varsivy. "Something bad is happening in the kitchen," he said, wrenching open the door, "and I'm not referring to the cauliflower cheese." Thank you for listening to some chosen chapters from the Velvet Paw of Asquith novels by Thomas Caulfield. To find out more about the Duvin books and to learn more about the emerging genre of new fable, visit velvetpawofasquith.com. To find out about Thomas's other books, visit thomascaulfield.com.